No gunfire, no bombardment, no battle at all. By morning, the water was still. On Ramree Island, 980 men entered a mangrove swamp 16 kilometers wide. Only 20 walked out alive. In February 1945, the retreating Japanese garrison chose the crossing over British surrender. The Guinness Book of Records once called what followed the greatest loss of human life to animals ever documented. Disease explains some deaths. Drowning explains others. Desertion accounts for a few more. But what explains why the screaming lasted all night long? Ramree Island sits off the western coast of Burma in the Bay of Bengal. In 1945, it was not a place anyone would choose to fight over. Flat, swampy, choked with tidal mangroves that stretched for miles in every direction. The trees grew out of black mud that swallowed boots to the knee. The water between them was brackish, warm, and thick with silt. At high tide, the channels rose waist deep. At low tide, the mud became a trap. Nothing about the island invited a prolonged battle, but the Japanese Imperial Army had held it since 1942, and the British wanted it back. Operation Matador began on January 26th. The plan was straightforward. Royal Marines would land on the northern beaches. The 26th Indian Division would push south along the coast. Between them, they would squeeze the Japanese garrison into a shrinking pocket of land. The island's only strategic value was a pair of small harbours that could serve as supply points for the broader campaign in Arakan. For the British, Ramree was a logistics problem. For the 900 Japanese soldiers still alive inside the perimeter, it was becoming a coffin. Colonel Kenichi Nagasawa commanded what remained of the garrison. His orders from regional command were clear: hold the island. Delay the British advance. Buy time for forces on the mainland. But by the first week of February, holding was no longer possible. The Royal Navy had positioned destroyers and motor launches along the southern and eastern coastline. Their guns covered every beach, every inlet, every navigable channel. Nagasawa's men had no resupply, no air cover, and no route out by sea. The British offered surrender terms through loudspeaker broadcasts from the ships. Nagasawa refused. What happened next was not a tactical decision in any conventional sense. It was a calculation made by men who considered capture worse than death. Nagasawa ordered his surviving troops to abandon their positions and march east, through the interior of the island, across 16 kilometers of mangrove swamp toward the mainland coast. From there, they would attempt to reach friendly lines by small boat or on foot. The order was given on the night of February 19th. Nearly 1,000 men began walking into the dark. The mangroves of Ramree are not a forest. They are a labyrinth. The roots grow above the waterline in tangled arches, forming walls of wood that block sight in every direction. The ground beneath is soft, unstable, and shifts with the tide. A man standing still can sink to his thighs in minutes. A man carrying a rifle and a pack sinks faster. There are no paths. There are no clearings. The only way through is forward, one step at a time, pulling each leg free from the mud before planting the next. British intelligence knew the mangroves well. Field reports from the campaign described the swamp as impassable for organised troop movement. But those same reports noted something else. The tidal channels that cut through the mangrove roots were home to one of the densest populations of saltwater crocodiles in Southeast Asia. Crocodilus porosus, the largest living reptile on Earth. Males in that region could reach 6 meters in length and weigh over 1,000 kilograms. They were territorial, nocturnal, and drawn to movement in shallow water. The British knew this. Nagasawa's men, most of them from the Japanese home islands, did not. Captain Arthur Hadley commanded one of the motor launches anchored off the southern shore that night. His logbook, filed with the flotilla report weeks later, noted that the first sounds came shortly after 2200 hours. scattered rifle shots from inside the swamp, then shouting. Then something he described as a sound unlike anything he had heard in 4 years of war. It was not the sound of gunfire or explosions. It was not the sound of men fighting other men. Hadley wrote that it was a continuous rising wall of human voices, punctuated by splashing, and beneath it all, a low, rhythmic thrashing that carried across the water for miles. Bruce Wright was a British naturalist serving with the Royal Marines. He was not on the island that night, but he arrived shortly after. In 1962, he published an account based on interviews with soldiers who had been there. Wright described the scene with clinical precision. The crocodiles had not hunted the soldiers. They had not stalked them through the channels. The soldiers had walked directly into the feeding territory of hundreds of animals, at night, at high tide. They were bleeding, exhausted, and unable to see more than a few meters ahead. The combination of movement, blood, and vibration in the water had triggered what Wright called a mass predatory response. Not a single coordinated attack, but hundreds of individual attacks happening simultaneously across a 16-kilometer front. No one on the British ships fired a shot that night. Hadley's logbook recorded that the commanding officer considered sending boats into the channels but decided against it. The risk to his own men was too high. The swamp was too dense for navigation in the dark, so the crews stood on deck and listened. Some covered their ears. Others did not move at all. A signalman aboard the nearest destroyer later told Wright that the worst part was not the volume. It was the way the sounds changed over the hours. At first, there were hundreds of voices, then dozens, then scattered, isolated cries that rose and fell with no pattern. And by the time the first grey light appeared on the horizon, the screaming had already stopped. Dawn on February 20th brought a silence that was, by every account, worse than the noise. Hadley's motor launch moved into the outer channels at first light. 2 reconnaissance teams from the 26th Indian Division pushed into the mangrove edge on foot. They found rifles first. Japanese Arisaka bolt-action rifles, half buried in the mud at odd angles, as though dropped mid-stride. Then boots, then helmets, then fragments of uniform cloth tangled in the roots, torn along seams that no branch could produce. The mud itself had been churned in long, dragging furrows that led from the shallows into the deeper channels and did not lead back. A field medic attached to the Indian Division recorded what the first patrol encountered roughly 2 kilometers inside the swamp. The remains they found were not intact. The medic's report described injuries consistent with large predator attacks, most of them concentrated below the waist. Many sets of remains were partial. The condition of what was recovered confirmed the pattern that Wright would later document. The animals seized from below in shallow water and did not release. Some remains had been dragged to the waterline and left half submerged, as though the predators had moved on when the next target presented itself. The British found the first survivors that same morning. They came out of the mangroves on the eastern shore in groups of 2 and 3, walking into open mudflats where Royal Marine patrols were waiting. They did not resist. They did not speak. A sergeant from the Durham Light Infantry who processed the first group of captives described them as men who appeared to have aged decades in a single night. Their uniforms were shredded. Several had deep lacerations on their arms and legs from the mangrove roots, but none of those wounds were what drew attention. It was their faces. Their eyes were open but unfocused, fixed on some middle distance that had nothing to do with the beach or the soldiers standing in front of them. 20 men. That was the final count. 20 Japanese soldiers emerged from a swamp that had swallowed nearly 1,000. The number became one of the most cited statistics of the Burma campaign, repeated in military histories, wildlife studies, and eventually in the Guinness Book of Records. But the number itself became part of the mystery. British operational records from Operation Matador confirmed that the garrison at Ramree had been reduced to roughly 900 combat-effective soldiers by mid-February. Some had already been killed in the preceding weeks of fighting. Others had been evacuated by submarine before the final encirclement. The exact figure that entered the swamp on the night of February 19th was never established beyond dispute. What is established is the arithmetic of elimination: 20 captured alive, roughly 170 confirmed killed during the weeks of conventional fighting before the retreat, a small number evacuated by sea. That leaves a gap of somewhere between 500 and 800 men whose fate was never documented by either side. The Japanese military did not recover remains. The British did not conduct a systematic search of the interior swamp. The mangroves, with their shifting tides and scavenger populations, ensured that whatever evidence existed would not last long. Wright's 1962 account attempted to fill that gap with biology. He argued that the crocodile population in the Ramree mangroves was unusually large due to wartime conditions. 3 years of Japanese occupation had disrupted local fishing patterns. Villages along the coast had been abandoned or relocated. The crocodiles, freed from human competition and disturbance, had bred and expanded into channels they might otherwise have avoided. Wright estimated that the swamp held several hundred adult animals at the time of the crossing. He did not attempt a precise number, no one could, but Wright's explanation, compelling as it reads, raised a question that wildlife biologists have debated for decades. Saltwater crocodiles are ambush predators. They are solitary hunters. They do not coordinate. A single crocodile will attack a single target, drag it underwater, and consume it over hours or days. What happened at Ramree does not fit that pattern. The attacks were simultaneous, spread across kilometers, and continued for hours. Wright attributed this to stimulus overload. Hundreds of large, warm, bleeding mammals moving through shallow water in darkness. Every territorial trigger activated at once across the entire population. Not cooperation, but coincidence on a scale that had never been recorded before and has not been recorded since. There is another detail that appears only in the field reports and never made it into Wright's published account. The patrol teams who entered the swamp on the morning of February 20th noted that the surviving crocodiles had not retreated. In every other documented encounter with saltwater crocodiles in the region, the animals fled at the approach of boats or groups of armed men. At Ramree, they did not. The reconnaissance team reported seeing large adults resting on mudbanks in full daylight, within 30 meters of the patrol path. They did not move. They watched. A lance corporal from the patrol later told his commanding officer that the animals looked, in his exact words, like they were full. The British did not linger in the swamp. The operational objective had been achieved. The Japanese garrison was destroyed, and the island was secured for use as a supply base. Within days, engineering units began constructing temporary docks on the eastern shore. Within weeks, Ramree was a functional logistics hub, feeding the broader advance into central Burma. The official after-action report for Operation Matador listed the engagement as a success. Casualties were light on the British side. Japanese losses were categorized under a single line that read, in its entirety, enemy garrison eliminated. No mention of crocodiles, no mention of the swamp crossing, no mention of the 20 men who walked out of the mangroves with empty eyes and shaking hands. But the field reports told a different story. And one of those reports, filed by a junior intelligence officer 3 weeks after the battle, contained a detail that would not surface publicly for nearly 2 decades. The officer had interrogated 2 of the 20 survivors through a translator. Both men gave nearly identical accounts of the night. Both described the same sequence of events. But one of them added something the other did not. He said the column had not entered the swamp as a single group. According to the survivor's account, Colonel Nagasawa had divided the garrison into 3 separate columns before the crossing began. The first, roughly 300 men, entered the mangroves at the northern edge around 2100 hours. The second group followed 30 minutes later through a channel 2 kilometers south. The third, the largest, entered last. The logic was simple. 3 smaller groups moving through different channels would be harder for British patrols to detect than a single column of 1,000. It was sound infantry tactics for evading a naval blockade. It was the worst possible strategy for crossing a swamp full of ambush predators. The survivor explained, through the translator, that the first column triggered the attacks. The men at the front of the line were wading through chest-deep water in a narrow channel when the first soldiers disappeared. There was no warning, no visible movement in the water beforehand. One moment a man was walking. The next, he was pulled under with a force that left no time for a sound. Then the man behind him. Then the man behind that one. By the time the column understood what was happening, the water around them had become a trap with no exit. The mangrove roots blocked lateral movement. The mud held their legs. The channel was too narrow to turn around. And the animals were already between them and the way they had come. The second column, entering from a different point, heard the first column die. The survivor said the sound reached them within minutes. Rifle shots, then screaming, then splashing that was too heavy and too rhythmic to be men struggling in water. The officers in the second group faced a decision that had no good outcome. They could continue forward into channels they now understood to be lethal. They could turn back toward British lines and surrender, or they could stop where they were and wait. Most of them stopped. They climbed onto the highest mangrove roots they could find and held their positions above the waterline. Some tied themselves to branches with belts and rifle straps. For a few hours, this worked. Then the tide came in. The tidal range in the Ramree mangroves fluctuates by roughly 3 meters. At low tide, the mud banks and root systems sit above the water. At high tide, everything below 2 meters is submerged. The men who had climbed the roots found themselves standing in rising water that reached their knees, then their waists, then their chests. The crocodiles did not need to hunt them. The water delivered them. The third column, the largest, entered the swamp last and penetrated deepest. The intelligence officer's report suggests that this group may have advanced as far as 8 kilometers into the interior before the attacks reached them. By that point, they were beyond any possibility of retreat. The channels behind them were already occupied by feeding animals. The channels ahead were unknown. Some soldiers in this group attempted to use grenades to clear a path through the water. The explosions killed or stunned crocodiles in the immediate blast radius. They also attracted every other predator within hearing distance. The concussions in the water acted as a dinner bell. What makes the Ramree crossing unique in the biological record is not the number of deaths. Crocodile attacks on humans are documented across Southeast Asia, Northern Australia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Dozens of people are killed every year. What is unique is the concentration. Nearly 1,000 potential prey items entered a confined habitat simultaneously, in conditions that maximized every advantage the predators possessed. Darkness, warm water, restricted movement. Open wounds from days of prior combat. The soldiers were not swimming in open water where they might have seen an approach. They were wading through channels barely wider than their own shoulders, surrounded by root walls that blocked their vision and their escape. A crocodile biologist who reviewed the Ramree accounts decades later noted that the event sits at the outer edge of what the species is capable of. Saltwater crocodiles are opportunistic. They will eat whatever is available, whenever it is available, but they are also cautious animals that avoid confrontation with groups of large prey. What overrode that caution at Ramree, Britain argued, was the sheer density of stimulus. Blood in the water from wounded soldiers, vibrations from hundreds of men moving through mud, panic-driven splashing that mimicked the distress signals of injured prey. Every evolved trigger the crocodile brain responds to was firing at maximum intensity, across the entire swamp, all at once. The result was not a hunt. It was a biological cascade. The 20 survivors emerged from different points along the eastern shore over the course of 2 days. Not all of them came out on February 20th. The last 3 were found on the 22nd, nearly 60 hours after the crossing began. They were dehydrated, delirious, and covered in cuts from the mangrove roots. One had a deep wound on his left calf, that the British field surgeon identified as consistent with a crocodile bite. The jaw impressions were still visible in the tissue. The man had somehow pulled free. None of the 20 were ever repatriated to Japan during the war. They were held as prisoners until 1946 and processed through the standard POW system. Their interrogation transcripts were filed with regional intelligence and classified as routine. The accounts they gave of the swamp crossing were not flagged as significant. In the context of a global war that was killing thousands every day, the loss of a single Japanese garrison in a Burmese swamp did not register as exceptional. The files sat in military archives, unread, for 17 years. It was Bruce Wright who found them. Or rather, it was Wright who understood what they meant. When he published his account in 1962, he drew not only from the survivor testimonies, but from a separate source that no previous writer had consulted, a set of environmental survey notes compiled by a British forestry officer who had been stationed on Ramree in 1946, 1 year after the battle. The officer had been sent to assess the island's timber resources for post-war reconstruction. His report contained 3 pages of species observations, rainfall data, and soil composition. But attached to the back, on a single loose sheet with no heading, was a hand-drawn map of the mangrove interior. Marked on it, in small red crosses, were the locations of 47 sets of human remains. 47, not 900, not 500. 47 bodies in a swamp that was supposed to have consumed an army. The forestry officer had not been looking for the dead. He had been surveying trees, but the remains were impossible to miss. Scattered across the mangrove interior, caught in root systems, half buried in silt banks that the tides had reshaped in the 12 months since the crossing. Some were skeletal, some were partial. Most were found in the tidal channels, not on the mud banks, which told its own story about how they had died and where the water had carried them afterward. The officer marked each location, noted the general condition of the remains in a few penciled words, and attached the map to his timber report without commentary. He was not an investigator, he was counting trees. Wright understood the significance immediately. 47 bodies recovered did not mean 47 total dead. It meant 47 dead whose remains had survived 12 months of tidal action, scavenger activity, and tropical decomposition in a mangrove swamp. The actual number consumed, drowned, or killed that night could have been many times higher. A body taken by a saltwater crocodile does not remain intact. The animal drags its prey underwater, wedges it beneath a submerged root or log, and returns to feed over days. In warm, brackish water with strong tidal currents, the remains that are not consumed are dispersed. Bones are carried into open water. Soft tissue disappears within weeks. The 47 the forestry officer found were, in all likelihood, the fraction that the swamp failed to erase completely. The facts of the Ramree crossing, stripped of legend, are these. On the night of February 19th, 1945, between 800 and 1,000 Japanese soldiers entered a 16-kilometer mangrove swamp on the western coast of Burma. They moved in 3 columns through tidal channels inhabited by one of the densest populations of saltwater crocodiles in the region. The crossing took place at night, at high tide, with many of the soldiers already wounded from weeks of combat. By morning, 20 men had emerged alive on the eastern shore. The rest were gone. The version most consistent with all available evidence is not a single cause of death. It was a layered catastrophe in which the crocodiles were the primary, but not the sole factor. The swamp killed in stages. The first stage was the mud itself. Men carrying weapons and equipment through waist-deep silt in darkness would have exhausted themselves within the first hour. Stragglers would have fallen behind, become separated from their units, and lost orientation in channels with no landmarks and no visibility. The second stage was the tide. As the water rose through the night, low-lying positions became submerged. Men who had stopped to rest or who were stuck in deep mud found themselves in rising water with no means of climbing above it. Drowning, not predation. likely accounted for a significant portion of the dead. The third stage was the crocodiles. The animals did not need to attack all 900 men. They needed only to attack the ones already compromised, the wounded, the stuck, the exhausted, the ones who had stopped moving. In a swamp that size, with a crocodile population right estimated in the hundreds, even a conservative rate of predation would have been devastating. The scale of carnage was consistent with every survivor account. Disease, dehydration, and exposure over the following hours would have claimed most of whoever remained. This explanation does not diminish the horror, it clarifies it. The Ramree crossing was not a single monstrous event. It was a converging series of lethal conditions, each one survivable on its own, none of them survivable together. The Japanese soldiers did not walk into a trap set by crocodiles. They walked into an environment where every variable, the tide, the mud, the darkness, the wounds, the animals, aligned against human survival simultaneously. The swamp did not attack them, it simply did not allow them to leave. The British military never conducted a formal investigation into the crossing. There was no inquiry, no recovery mission, no effort to determine how many men had died or by what specific means. The after-action report for Operation Matador remained unchanged. Enemy garrison eliminated. The Guinness Book of Records listed the event as the greatest number of fatalities in a crocodile attack. The cited figure of 900 came directly from Wright's 1962 account. Modern historians have challenged that number, arguing that it conflates crocodile kills with combat deaths, drowning, and disease. The revised estimates range from 300 to 500 deaths attributable primarily to the animals, with the remainder caused by other factors during the crossing. But no revision has been able to produce a definitive count, because no one counted. The Japanese government never acknowledged the Ramree crossing as a distinct event. The soldiers who died in the swamp were listed among the broader casualties of the Burma campaign. No families were notified of the specific circumstances. No remains were recovered or repatriated. The 20 survivors who returned to Japan after the war did not speak publicly about what they had experienced. Japan was processing the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the firebombing of Tokyo, and the loss of over 2 million military dead. The fate of a single garrison on a forgotten island did not command attention. The swamp reclaimed its silence. Ramree itself returned to its pre-war obscurity. The temporary docks the British built were dismantled after the war. The mangroves grew back over the channels the soldiers had waded through. Local fishermen resumed their work along the coast, avoiding the interior swamp as their ancestors had always done. The crocodiles remained. They are still there. The population today is smaller than it was in 1945, reduced by decades of habitat loss and hunting, but the species has not left. The tidal channels still rise and fall with the same rhythm they followed on the night of February 19th. The mud still holds what it is given. If every commander knew the swamp was impassable, who gave the order to march?